The dust settled on a life's worth of memories, coating everything in a fine, brown shroud of finality. Arthur stood before the ranch house, his shoulders slumped not just from the 75 years he had carried, but from the weight of a loss so profound it hollowed out his insides. The house, built by his grandfather's hands, felt like a stranger now. Its familiar porch, where his wife Martha used to sit with him and watch the sun bleed across the valley, was occupied by two stern-faced men hired by the bank. Sterling Blackwood, the bank's owner and the town's unimpeachable patriarch, stood near the gate, his posture radiating a clean, predatory satisfaction. He checked his pocket watch, the gold chain glinting, a small, cruel star in the harsh afternoon light. He wasn't looking at Arthur, he was looking at his schedule, at the future Arthur was no longer a part of. The town sheriff, a man Arthur had known since he was a boy, was present but functionally absent, his gaze fixed on a distant butte as if the fate of the entire world rested upon its rocky peak. Anything to avoid meeting the old rancher's eyes. A small crowd of townsfolk had gathered at a respectable distance, their silence a thick blanket of mixed pity, fear, and a shameful sort of relief that it was him and not them. They watched the end of an era, the quiet erasure of a man from the landscape he was born to. One of Blackwood's men approached Arthur, holding out a small, worn leather satchel. "Your personal effects, sir," the man said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. Inside were a few tintypes of Martha, a spare shirt, and his father's old shaving razor. Everything else, the furniture Martha had so carefully chosen, the tools worn smooth by his own hands, the very scent of home, now belonged to the bank. It belonged to Sterling Blackwood. Arthur took the satchel, his gnarled fingers fumbling with the strap. He didn't speak. What was there to say? The legal papers had been absolute, the debt undeniable, a creeping sickness that had started small years ago and had finally consumed everything. He had tried to fight it, had pleaded for more time, but Blackwood's letters had become colder, the language more severe, until the final notice had arrived, a nail in the coffin of his life. He turned his back on the house, on the silent crowd, on the man who had orchestrated his ruin. He began to walk, his worn boots scuffing the dirt road that led away from the only home he had ever known. Each step was an act of profound violence against his own heart. He could feel Blackwood's eyes on his back, a final, dismissive glance before the man turned to direct his men, his voice crisp and authoritative as he began the process of cataloguing his new acquisition. The sun beat down, and Arthur just kept walking, a ghost leaving his own grave behind. He did not know where he was going, only that he could not stay within sight of the valley. To see the lights of other homes, to hear the distant sound of a life that was no longer his, would be a torture he could not endure. His feet, driven by a memory deeper than conscious thought, turned him towards the high country, towards the jagged peaks that clawed at the sky. The path grew steep, the air thinner. The world of men, of deeds and debts, fell away behind him, replaced by the ancient silence of stone and pine. He was utterly alone now, a condition he had felt creeping in ever since Martha had passed 3 years prior. Her absence had been a quiet ache, a constant, low hum of grief. This, however, was a roaring void. This was the end of everything they had built together. He collapsed onto a rocky outcrop, his breath coming in ragged bursts. He pulled the satchel onto his lap and opened it, his fingers tracing the faded image of Martha on a tintype. Her smile was a distant shore he could no longer reach. He remembered a promise he had made to her, whispered in the dark of their bedroom as she grew weaker. "I'll keep the ranch safe, Martha," he had said. "I'll die on this land, just like my father did." The bitter, dry sob escaped his throat. He had failed. He had failed her, failed his father, failed the generations that had poured their sweat and blood into that soil. As he sat there, adrift in his despair, another memory surfaced, this one much older, from the mists of his boyhood. It was his grandmother, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes sharp and knowing. She had taken him aside one day, pressing a heavy, ornate iron key into his small hand. It was black with age, its design intricate and strange. "This is for the old place," she had said, her voice low and serious. "The cellar. You don't go there unless you have to. You don't open it unless the world turns its back on you and you've got nothing left to lose. Remember that, Arthur." When they take everything, they still haven't taken the truth he hadn't understood then. The old place was just a pile of ruins in the mountains, the foundation of the cabin his great-grandparents had first built, abandoned for the better land in the valley. The cellar was just a hole in the ground. But he had kept the key. Through all the years, he had kept it in a small pouch with his father's things. He reached into his satchel, his fingers brushing past the razor and finding the small, deer-hide pouch. He opened it, and there it was. The iron key, cold and heavy in his palm. The world had turned its back on him. He had nothing left to lose. He knew, with a sudden, weary certainty, where he was going. The ascent was a pilgrimage of pain, each step a negotiation between his aging body and the unyielding mountain. The trail his memory guided him on was barely there, a ghost of a path reclaimed by stubborn brush and creeping forest. As he climbed, the valley below became a patchwork quilt of greens and browns, his own ranch a tiny, insignificant square within it, a wound that was already beginning to scar over in the distance. The physical exertion stripped away the shock, leaving behind the raw, throbbing pulp of memory. He saw his father, a man made of leather and resolve, standing on the porch and staring east, a worried frown etched on his face. "The Blackwoods are buying up the Miller place," his father had said to him once, though Arthur had been too young to grasp the gravity. A man who buys debt instead of raising cattle isn't a rancher. As a collector he remembered the first Sterling Blackwood, the current one's father, a man with soft hands and a smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He had arrived with money from some distant city, establishing the town's first and only bank, presenting himself as a partner to the hard-working folk of the valley. He offered loans for expansion, for new equipment, for surviving a bad winter. At first, it seemed like a blessing. But soon, the whispers started. A misplaced document here, a sudden change in interest terms there. Families who had worked their land for a generation found themselves ensnared in legal complexities they couldn't comprehend, their simple handshake deals twisted into ironclad contracts. Arthur recalled a heated argument he had overheard as a boy, his own father's voice raised in the barn, confronting the elder Blackwood over a discrepancy in a property line survey. Blackwood had been calm, dismissive, producing a sheaf of official-looking papers that contradicted the landmarks his family had recognized for 50 years. His father had emerged from the barn defeated, a shadow of resignation falling over him that never truly lifted. "You can't fight a man who owns the ink and the paper," he had muttered that night at the dinner table. Arthur now understood. The debt that had cost him his home wasn't the result of one bad season or a poor business decision. It was the final, patient move in a game that had been played against his family for 2 generations. The Blackwoods hadn't just collected land, they had collected futures, harvesting the dreams of others to build their own dynasty. The sun began to dip below the western peaks, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a beautiful, indifferent spectacle. He was tired, his bones aching with a weariness that felt ancient. But the cold weight of the key in his pocket was a new kind of anchor. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was something harder, colder. It was purpose. He found the homestead at dusk, the fading light filtering through the dense canopy of ancient pines. It was less a ruin and more a memory etched into the landscape. A low, crumbling stone foundation outlined the footprint of a small cabin, now completely overcome by nature. Wild moss grew over the stones like a thick, green blanket, and the center of the old home was now occupied by a towering fir tree, a silent testament to the decades that had passed. For a moment, Arthur felt a pang of despair. It was a place of ghosts, of endings. But then his eyes caught it, nestled against the far side of the foundation, almost perfectly camouflaged by a curtain of thick, tangled ivy. A low, heavy door of dark, petrified-looking timber, set at an angle into the earth. The cellar. He moved towards it, his heart hammering against his ribs. The air around the entrance was cooler, smelling of damp earth and decay. He knelt, his old knees protesting, and began to pull at the vines, his hands raw and scraped by the time he had cleared a space around the large, rusted iron ring that served as a handle. There was a keyhole, a jagged slit of black crusted with rust. He retrieved the key his grandmother had given him. It felt like an artifact from another world, impossibly old. With a trembling hand, he inserted it into the lock. It slid in with a grating screech of metal on metal. He tried to turn it. It wouldn't budge. It was frozen solid by a century of damp and disuse. He put his entire weight into it, his face contorted with effort, a low groan escaping his lips. He felt a sharp pain in his shoulder, but he refused to stop. This was it. This was the only thing left. With a final, desperate heave, something inside the lock gave way with a deafening crack that echoed in the twilight quiet. The sound was so loud, so final, it felt like a bone breaking. The lock was open. He paused, catching his breath, the coppery taste of exertion in his mouth. Then he gripped the iron ring with both hands and pulled. The door was immensely heavy, a slab of wood and iron that seemed fused to the earth. He strained, his muscles screaming, digging his heels into the soft ground for leverage. Slowly, agonizingly, it began to move, scraping against its stone frame. An inch. Then another. Finally, with a deep groan, it swung open, revealing a set of steep stone steps descending into perfect, absolute blackness. The air that rose from the opening was cold and still, carrying the scent of deep earth and something else, the dry, faint smell of paper and preservation. He took out the lantern and flint he carried, and after a few tries, a small, warm flame flickered to life, pushing back the oppressive dark. Holding the lantern high, he began his descent into his family's forgotten past. The stone steps were slick with a thin film of moisture, and Arthur descended with deliberate care, the lantern light throwing his long, dancing shadow against the earthen walls. The cellar was small, no larger than a modest pantry, with a low, arched ceiling of packed earth held in place by a few thick, dark beams. It was surprisingly dry, the chill in the air clean and ancient, not the damp rot he had expected. The light from his lantern revealed shelves carved directly into the dirt walls, but they were empty, covered in a delicate lacework of cobwebs. His gaze swept the small space, a flicker of disappointment beginning to extinguish the fire of purpose that had driven him this far. Perhaps it was just a root cellar after all. Perhaps his grandmother's words were just the ramblings of an old woman, a fairy tale to soothe a young boy. But then he saw it. Tucked into the deepest, darkest corner, partially obscured by one of the support beams, was a small chest. It was not a grand treasure chest, but a simple, sturdy-looking box made of dark wood and bound with thick straps of black iron. It was coated in a layer of dust so thick it looked like grey felt. He approached it slowly, reverently, and knelt before it. There was no lock, only a heavy iron latch. His fingers, caked with the dirt and grime of his journey, trembled as he lifted it. The latch was stiff, but it moved, and with a soft click, it came free. He took a deep breath, the lantern light flickering across his weathered face, and lifted the lid. The hinges let out a long, mournful creak, the only sound in the silent earth. He expected to see gold, or perhaps some forgotten family heirlooms. But what lay inside was far more precious and far more dangerous. The chest was filled with documents, bundles of paper and what looked like journals, all carefully wrapped in waxed oilcloth to protect them from the damp. He gently lifted the topmost bundle, his hand surprisingly steady now. He unwrapped the cloth, revealing a thick, leather-bound ledger. He opened it. The pages were filled with his grandmother's elegant, precise script. It was a record of accounts. His eye scanned the columns, the dates, the figures. It was a meticulous accounting of cattle sales, year by year, cross-referenced with payments made to S. Blackwood, Sr. His breath caught in his throat. He dug deeper into the chest, his movements becoming more urgent. He found a bundle of letters, tied with a faded ribbon. They were correspondence between his grandmother and the elder Blackwood, polite but firm, discussing the terms of a loan. And then he found it, at the very bottom of the chest. It was the original deed to the ranch, written on thick, heavy parchment, the ink faded but still perfectly legible. And folded within it, a second document. A contract. The loan agreement. He read it, his eyes devouring the words. It detailed a significant sum loan to his grandparents for the expansion of their herd. But then he saw the addendum, a handwritten paragraph at the bottom, signed by both his grandmother and Sterling Blackwood Sr., and witnessed by the town's first magistrate. The loan was not to be repaid with currency. It was to be repaid with a 20% share of the ranch's cattle profits for a period of 50 years, and no longer. The final payment, according to his grandmother's ledger, had been made in the spring of 1848. 27 years ago. The debt Blackwood had used to foreclose on him, the debt that had been passed from father to son, was a complete and utter fabrication. It had been paid in full before he had even taken over the ranch from his father. It was a lie. A generational fraud. The entire Blackwood dynasty was built on a foundation of theft. The cellar, which had seemed so dark and suffocating moments before, suddenly felt illuminated by the brilliant, searing light of truth. The weight of the discovery was staggering. It settled upon him not as a burden, but as a mantle of cold, hard fury. For 2 generations, his family had lived under the shadow of a manufactured debt, scrimping and saving, believing they were perpetually behind, while the Blackwoods had built an empire on their stolen prosperity. His father's worry, his own lifelong struggle, it was all based on a meticulously crafted lie. The respect and power Sterling Blackwood commanded in town was nothing more than a monument to a crime. Arthur knew, with absolute certainty, that walking into Blackwood's bank and presenting this evidence would be a fool's errand. The documents would disappear. He would be dismissed as a crazy, grief-stricken old man. Blackwood controlled the sheriff, the judge, the narrative of the entire valley. To fight him, Arthur couldn't just have the truth, he needed an audience. He needed to turn the town's reverence for Blackwood into a weapon against him. But he couldn't do it alone. He was one old man against a fortress. He needed an ally, someone on the inside, someone with a conscience that hadn't yet been bought or intimidated. His mind sifted through the faces of the townspeople, dismissing them one by one. Most were too afraid, too indebted to Blackwood themselves. But then he thought of her. Clara. The young woman who worked as a clerk in the town records office. She was quiet, intelligent, and had always treated him with a kindness that felt genuine, not condescending. When he'd been in the office weeks ago, trying to make sense of the foreclosure notices, she had looked at him with an expression of profound sympathy, her eyes hinting at a frustration she could not voice. He had seen a spark of defiance in her. Carefully, he rewrapped the most critical documents, the contract with its addendum and the final pages of the ledger, and hid them deep within his shirt. He left the chest as it was, covered it with an old canvas sheet he found in a corner, and ascended from the cellar, sealing the heavy door behind him. The journey back down the mountain was fueled by a new, potent energy. It was no longer the shuffle of a defeated man, but the determined stride of an avenger. He moved carefully, sticking to the shadows as he reached the outskirts of town late the next day. He waited until dusk, watching the clerk's office. He saw Clara leave, a small figure walking home with a stack of books. He followed at a distance, his heart pounding. He approached her on a quiet street, away from the main thoroughfare. "Miss Clara," he said, his voice a low rasp. She startled, her eyes wide with fear, which quickly softened to concern when she recognized him. "Mr. Arthur? What are you doing here?" "They said you'd left the valley. I needed to find something first," he said. He looked around, ensuring they were alone. "I need your help. And I need you to believe me." He pulled out the ledger page, the paper crinkling in the quiet air. He held it out for her to see in the fading light. "This is a page from my grandmother's accounts. It shows the final payment made to Sterling Blackwood's father. The debt was settled in 1848." Clara stared at the document, her brow furrowed in concentration. She traced the elegant script with her finger. Then she looked up at him, her expression a mixture of shock and dawning comprehension. "My grandfather was the town clerk for 40 years, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "He always talked about the old families. He used to say there was a great wrong at the heart of this town, a story buried in paper and ink. He said the Blackwood fortune was ill-gotten." She looked from the paper to Arthur's face, and in his tired, determined eyes, she saw the truth of her grandfather's words. "What do you need me to do?" A silent pact was formed between them in the deepening twilight, a partnership forged between the old rancher with nothing left to lose and the young clerk who had seen too much injustice from behind her desk. They knew this was more than a fight for a single ranch, it was a battle for the soul of the town. A private meeting was out of the question. Sterling Blackwood was a master of control and manipulation. In his office, behind closed doors, he would twist their words, deny the evidence, and have them thrown out, burying the truth forever. The stage had to be public. It had to be undeniable. It had to be a spectacle. Founders Day, Clara said, her voice gaining strength, the idea taking root. It's in 2 days. The whole town will be in the square. Mr. Blackwood is the master of ceremonies. He's giving the keynote address. The irony was perfect, almost poetic. The man who had built his legacy on a historical lie would be brought down during the very celebration of that history. It was a daunting, terrifying plan. They would have one chance to get it right. For the next day and a half, they worked in secret. Arthur remained hidden in an old, abandoned line shack on the edge of town, studying his grandmother's documents until he knew every date, every figure, every word by heart. His role was to be the voice of the past, the living embodiment of the injustice. Clara's role was tactical. She was the one who could arm them with corroboration. With quiet courage, she navigated the dusty archives of the town records office. She told her superior she was organizing the historical records for the Founders' Day display, a plausible excuse that gave her unrestricted access. She unearthed old survey maps that matched the boundaries on Arthur's original deed, not the altered ones the Blackwoods had filed decades later. She found early town council minutes that mentioned the loan agreement, referring to it as a 50-year profit-sharing arrangement. Each piece of paper she found was another stone in the foundation of their case, another nail in Blackwood's coffin. She smuggled the copies out at the end of the day, meeting Arthur in the deepening gloom. As they pieced it all together, the sheer audacity of the Blackwood fraud became clearer. It was a masterpiece of patient, predatory greed. The tension was a palpable thing, a tightening cord in Arthur's chest. He saw the risk Clara was taking. If they failed, Blackwood would ruin her. "You don't have to do this, child," he told her one evening, his voice heavy with concern. She looked at him, her young face set with a resolve that reminded him of his grandmother. "My grandfather knew something was wrong, but he was too afraid to speak," she said. He lived with that fear his whole life. I won't. In that moment, Arthur saw that this was no longer just his fight. He was merely the vessel for a truth that had been waiting a lifetime to be told. The old, broken man who had trudged up the mountain was gone, replaced by a figure of quiet, unshakable resolve. He was ready. The day of the celebration dawned bright and clear, a perfect, mocking sky for the storm that was about to break. The town square was festooned with bunting and flags, the air filled with the sounds of a brass band and the cheerful chatter of families. It was the valley's most important day, a time to celebrate its pioneers, its progress, its shared history. At the center of it all was Sterling Blackwood, standing on a specially erected podium, looking every bit the benevolent founder. He was dressed in a fine suit, his silver hair gleaming in the sun, his smile broad and confident. He moved through the crowd before his speech, shaking hands, patting children on the head, the picture of civic virtue. No one noticed the old man standing at the edge of the crowd, his face weathered and grim, his eyes fixed on the man on the podium with an unnerving intensity. Arthur watched, feeling a strange sense of detachment. He saw not a respected leader, but a thief in fine clothes, presiding over a celebration paid for with stolen lives. Clara stood near the back of the clerk's office, its window overlooking the square. She clutched a portfolio containing the copies she had made, her knuckles white. She gave Arthur a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was time. Blackwood took the stage to loud applause. He began his speech, his voice rich and resonant, booming across the square. He spoke of hardship and perseverance, of the integrity and hard work that had built their prosperous community. He spoke of his father, portraying him as a visionary who had helped lift the valley's families from poverty to success. "Our foundations are built on trust," Blackwood declared, his arms outstretched. "On the principle that a man's word is his bond, and that honesty is the bedrock of all we have achieved." As he spoke these words, Arthur began to move. He walked slowly, deliberately, from the edge of the crowd toward the podium. He didn't push or shove. He simply walked, and a path seemed to open before him. People turned, their smiles fading, replaced by looks of confusion and surprise. Whispers followed him like a ripple in a pond. "Isn't that old Arthur? I thought he was gone. What's he doing?" The sheriff saw him and started to move, but the density of the crowd and the sheer unexpectedness of the moment slowed him. Arthur reached the foot of the podium just as Blackwood was winding down, basking in the anticipated applause. The old rancher did not shout. He waited for a pause in Blackwood's oration, and then he spoke, his voice old and cracked, yet carrying an authority that cut through the festive air and commanded silence. "You speak of history, Mr. Blackwood," Arthur said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage and a lifetime of pain. "Let us speak of the true history. The one written in this deed." He held up the ancient parchment, its wax seal still intact. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Blackwood froze, his smile vanishing, his face paling. For the first time in his life, he looked uncertain, exposed. The show had begun. The silence that fell over the town square was absolute. Every eye was fixed on the confrontation at the foot of the podium, the powerful, polished banker and the ruined, resurrected rancher. Sterling Blackwood was the first to recover, his expression hardening into a mask of dismissive contempt. "Arthur, this is neither the time nor the place for your grievances," he said, his voice laced with condescending pity. "The matter of your ranch has been settled by the law. It was settled by your law," Arthur retorted, his voice growing stronger. "A law based on a lie that your father created and you perfected." He took a step closer, holding the deed out like a shield. "This is my grandmother's deed. And this," he said, pulling the folded contract from his pocket, "is the loan agreement she signed with your father. I imagine you've never seen the original, have you? Only the version your family filed with the court." Before Blackwood or the now advancing sheriff could react, Clara stepped out from the crowd. She moved with a purpose that belied her youth, her face pale but resolute. "And I have the town's records to corroborate it," she announced, her voice clear and steady. She held up the portfolio. "Old survey maps, council minutes. They all tell the same story." She began to read from a copy of the contract's addendum, her voice ringing out across the stunned assembly. "The loan is to be considered repaid in full upon the transfer of 20% of cattle profits for a term of 50 years. Final term year, 1848. The date hung in the air, an irrefutable fact. Arthur then unrolled the ledger pages. He didn't need to read them, he knew them by heart. "My grandmother recorded every single payment," he said, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, meeting the eyes of other old families. "The Conroys. The Millers. The Davidsons. Your family struggled under Blackwood debts, too, didn't you? Did you ever wonder why you could never quite get ahead? Why every good year was followed by a new fee or a sudden change in terms?" A murmur went through the crowd. He was touching a nerve, awakening long-dormant suspicions. An old man near the front, Mr. Davidson, stepped forward. "My father always said the numbers from the bank never made sense," he said, his voice shaking. He said Blackwood Sr. had 2 sets of books. The accusation, once whispered in private, was now spoken in the open. The foundation of Blackwood's authority began to crumble. He stared at the documents, at Clara, at the mutinous faces in the crowd, a cornered animal realizing the trap had been sprung. "This is slander. It's preposterous," he bellowed, but his voice lacked its usual command. It was shrill, desperate. The sheriff reached for Arthur's arm. "All right, that's enough," but several men from the crowd stepped in front of him, blocking his path. The town was no longer watching. It was participating. The moral authority had shifted, right there in the sun-drenched square, and it no longer belonged to the man on the podium. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic for Sterling Blackwood. The public accusation, supported by physical evidence and the sudden, vocal corroboration of other families, was a blow from which his reputation could not recover. The carefully constructed image of the benevolent town father shattered into 1,000 pieces, revealing the predatory creature beneath. The crowd, which had assembled to celebrate him, now turned on him, their murmurs growing into a low, angry roar. They were not just angry about Arthur's ranch, they were angry about the decades of quiet intimidation, the financial pressures, the sense that the game was always rigged in the bank's favor. They were angry about their own silenced parents and grandparents. They saw in Arthur's story the shadow of their own struggles. The sheriff, a man who operated on the principle of self-preservation, saw the tide turn with undeniable force. His loyalty to Blackwood was a matter of convenience and power, and that power had just evaporated. He looked at the hard, unforgiving faces of the townsmen standing between him and Arthur, and he made a political calculation. He stepped back from Arthur and turned his attention to a sputtering, enraged Sterling Blackwood. "Mr. Blackwood," the sheriff said, his voice now officially neutral, "I think you'd better come with me down to the office. We need to look at these documents. It was not an arrest, not yet, but it was a public stripping of power." 2 deputies escorted a stunned Blackwood from the podium, no longer a pillar of the community, but a suspect. He was heckled and jeered as he was led away, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. The Founders' Day celebration was over. In its place was a raw, chaotic, and cathartic town meeting. Clara and Arthur were surrounded, not by a mob, but by a community desperate for the truth. One by one, others came forward with their own stories of suspicious foreclosures and inexplicable debts owed to the Blackwood Bank. It was a dam of silence breaking, releasing a flood of generational grievance. Clara, no longer just a clerk, became the calm center of the storm, carefully taking down statements, organizing the evidence that was now pouring in from all corners. She had not just helped one man, she had given a voice to the entire valley. Arthur stood quietly amidst the turmoil, the ledger and deed held tightly in his hands. He felt a profound, aching sense of vindication, not just for himself, but for his father and his grandmother. Her foresight, her meticulous record-keeping, her faith that the truth, if preserved, would one day be enough, it had all been validated. He had not just fought a man, he had corrected history. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the square, but for the first time in a very long time, the town did not feel like a place of darkness. It felt like a place awakening. The weeks that followed were a quiet revolution. The legal proceedings against Sterling Blackwood were swift and decisive. Faced with his father's own signature on the original contract, the meticulous ledgers, and the corroborating town records unearthed by Clara, his case collapsed entirely. More evidence surfaced as a federal marshal, called in to investigate the bank, uncovered the systematic fraud that had been the Blackwood family's true business for half a century. The court not only nullified the foreclosure on Arthur's ranch but invalidated dozens of other outstanding debts, freeing families from financial bondage. The Blackwood Bank was seized, its assets liquidated to pay back a portion of what had been stolen. Sterling Blackwood, the man who once held the fate of the valley in his hands, was left with nothing but his shame, sentenced to a long prison term for fraud and racketeering. The town, in a collective act of penance and renewal, helped Arthur move back to his home. Men he had known his whole life, men who had stood by silently as he was evicted, now showed up with hammers and lumber, helping repair the neglect the ranch had suffered. Women brought food and helped clean the house, scrubbing away the cold, impersonal touch of the bank's possession. It was a quiet, communal apology, an acknowledgement of their own complicity and a promise to be better. Clara became a hero in the valley. Her courage and integrity had made her one of the most respected figures in the community. She was soon elected as the new town clerk, entrusted with preserving the very history she had helped to uncover and correct. She and Arthur formed a deep and abiding friendship, a bond between the generation that had suffered the injustice and the generation that had helped to heal it. Arthur stood on his porch one evening, watching the last rays of sunlight paint the clouds. The air was clean, the land was quiet, and it was his. He ran a hand over the smooth, worn wood of the porch railing where Martha used to rest her arms. He felt her presence not as an aching absence, but as a warm, peaceful memory. He had kept his promise. He had saved their home. He thought of his grandmother's key, not just as a tool to open a lock, but as a symbol of the truth we carry within us, the stories that must be preserved, waiting for a time when someone is brave enough to tell them. He had reclaimed more than just his land and his house. He had reclaimed his dignity, his family's name, and the very history of the valley. The world had turned its back on him, and in the darkness, he had found the light. His journey had ended where it began, on the land that held his heart, but he was no longer a lonely old man at the mercy of fate. He was a testament to the enduring power of truth, a quiet, resilient rancher who had reminded an entire community that the deepest roots can never be truly severed, and that justice, no matter how long it is buried, will always, eventually, find its way home.